Like this is the iPhone moment of the AI enabled by Apple by building it into the iPhone. Wow.
For end users, this is like a great step forward, and it's probably a key turning point in AI's iPhone moment. But for almost everyone else in the AI ecosystem, it's probably really bad news. Welcome to the Art and Science of AI, a podcast about the science of how AI works and the art of using AI to reimagine your life, business, and society. I'm one of your hosts, Nikhil Madirala. I'm an AI product manager, and I love helping people learn about AI.
And I'm your other host, Piyush, and I'm super curious about AI. And we're two best friends who love talking about AI. Nikhil, I feel like the whole world has been talking about just one thing over the last 1 week. That's Apple's recent event and announcements. And I've been extremely busy this week, so I didn't get a chance to follow exactly what happened, what they announced. So I'm very curious to just learn more about what is it that they announced. But there is one thing that trickled into my consciousness. There's a meme that Elon Musk shared. I want to share this actually with you. I don't know if you've seen this. Perhaps you have already seen this. But I love internet memes, and I laughed so hard when I saw this meme. So it is like one of the funniest memes I've ever seen. But I think like Elon Musk is saying that he's going to stop ban Apple devices.
Before you do that, let's describe this for people who are listening to it.
I don't even know how to describe it. Do you mind describing what you're seeing on the screen?
So there's a picture of a couple, and one person is drinking from a coconut. On the coconut, it says iPhone, and the woman, it says Apple, and supposedly Apple is trying to drink from the iPhone. And then there's a guy who has a straw into her mouth, and it's drinking from that, and it says your data, and on the guy, it says OpenAI. So I guess what he's saying is how Apple Intelligence works is that Apple sucks your data out of your iPhone, and then OpenAI sucks your data out of Apple. I guess that's
whoever is listening to this, I'm telling you, no matter how you pictured this image, you cannot possibly imagine what we're seeing right now. So I would highly recommend just like looking at this one meme. But I mean, I found it hilarious. But I'm just like super curious to know like what's going on. Like, what did Apple announce? Why do they keep rebranding everything? Like, there's already a word for AI, artificial intelligence. Why do they have to come up with their own brand name? But and what is with the Elon Musk's apprehension? Like, is there some truth to it? So I'm just very curious.
I think these are great questions. Yeah, I think privacy is a big topic. We should definitely talk about that. Maybe let's just first jump in by talking about what Apple even announced this week, and let's go through that, and then let's talk about some of these questions about privacy, how it all works, and then we can think about what are some of the implications of this for users and for businesses and society. Let's start by summarizing all the AI stuff Apple announced in their event last week. So the event, for context, is WWDC. It's called Worldwide Developer Conference. It's their annual event where they announce updates on their software side to their operating system and to their apps. And this is separate from the hardware event. So Apple has two major events every year. One is WW, as it's commonly known for WWDC. That's the software event, and then they have a hardware event later. And often what they do is they pre-announce some cool software stuff that they say is coming soon, and that'll only work with the new hardware. In this case, they didn't do that. All the stuff they announced, it works with last year's iPhone. So that's the context of this event. And it's supposed
I didn't know that they had like two separate events, one's focused on software and one's on hardware. That's interesting.
And technically, when it first started, this software event was supposed to be focused on developers. That's why it's called Worldwide Developer Conference. So it's really supposed to be for developers to know what are the new features coming out, how can I build cool apps using these new features, and then the hardware event was more focused on consumers. But over time, it's kind of morphed, and even WW is like a big PR event, so they know that it's not just developers who are watching this, consumers, investors, everyone's watching it. So there's a lot of pressure to make it like a big event and announce a lot of things. And of course, like this is coming at the tail end of like a bunch of other companies' big events. We've seen Google, Microsoft, and others have their big events, and this is kind of the last one of the season, but it was probably the one that has the most implications, I think, for the ecosystem. But
really?
Yeah. We can talk about why, but let's jump into what they actually announced. Actually, I have a really cool video I wanted to share. So maybe let's break down the category of things. I would say there are like two main ways in which I would break down the stuff they announced. They organized their event differently. They went through it by device and operating system. So they talked about like iPhone, iPad, watch, and they went through it in that order. But since we're focused on AI, let's just cut through all that. And I'm going to break it down into two segments of things that they announced. First was they announced a bunch of new AI capabilities in their own apps. So there's things like making the calculator smarter, making mail smarter, making photos smarter, and we can talk a little bit about those. But then the second type of thing they announced is making Siri smarter, and that's an AI assistant that works across multiple apps. So let's first talk about what they're doing in their apps to put AI in there, and then we'll talk about what they're doing with Siri and the operating system. The second one I think is a lot more interesting. Sure, shall we jump into it?
Like, what video?
I think the coolest in the first category of things of like new AI features in apps, one of the coolest things they showed was the iPad calculator app, how it does handwriting recognition and math for you. So I'm going to share a quick video snippet from MKBHD's review of this, and let's start there. All right, so let's play this.
They pulled the Apple Pencil off the side, and they pulled up what's called math notes. And it was pretty sick. So now on the iPad, you can actually write down equations in handwriting, and it will understand what you wrote, and it'll answer the
that's cool.
in your handwriting. And then if you adjust the equation or add new information or something, it automatically updates the answer, which was...
And the answer is also in your handwriting. That's so cool.
If that wasn't impressive enough, it also supports variables. So you can have variables written all over the page. So look at this. It has G and X and A and H. And then it's a labeled Y as the height here. So you can ask for an equation using these variables, and it can give you an answer. And if you want, you can do a Y equals equation, and it'll give you a graph with real-time adjustment of any of the variables in your equation. I mean, I wish I was in 6th grade again, so this could be my full-time calculator. This is sick.
I was thinking exactly the same. How I wish that this was available when we were in... I don't know if Marcus Brown was learning
Apple
all this in 6th grade, like he's some kind of a genius. I think we learned it much later in our schooling, but that would have been awesome. This is so cool.
And this is the stuff Apple does really well, right? They're not the first to enter any new technology or new area, but when they do it in a way that just really delights customers. And this is, I think, a delightful customer experience. And like Marquez said, I would love to be in school right now and have access to this tool.
Yeah. That's true, actually. Yeah, it is. Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, it is. It was delightful just watching him play around with it. So I can't imagine how it would be. I have an iPad. Can I try it now? Like, is it something that's coming soon or?
I'm actually not sure. I don't remember if they said, and I don't know if it's something that works on all. You have an iPad with the Apple Pencil?
I think
it's possibly something that's only supported on the iPad Pro. I'm not 100% sure.
I have a Pro. And I have a pencil. I've never used a pencil. I have one, but
try it and report back. Yeah, if it works.
That's cool. That's awesome.
So that was the first category of things they announced. Like I said, it's making their apps smarter with AI and infusing AI capabilities into a bunch of Apple's apps. And this, I think, was the coolest example of a truly delightful customer experience. But some of the other things they announced was one is AI in the Mail app. So if you're using the Mail app on your iPhone or iPad or Mac OS, it does things for you like it can proofread emails you're writing, it can help you rewrite emails, It can help categorize your emails for you. So this is the kind of stuff that people are commonly doing with ChatGPT, for example. You were talking about it at some point previously. You take an email, you copy it into ChatGPT, and you ask it to rephrase it for you. So now that's going to be done directly in the Mail app, and you don't need to go elsewhere to do that. That was really cool. Then they announced AI capabilities in the Photos app. You can do things like cleaning up images. If you have an image and you have random people in your background, say it's a family photo, you can just quickly like remove other people. They also announced a thing called the Image Playground, where you can do image generation. You can create your own images and emojis. And so this is stuff that is not new to us. Like
I was just going to say, it looks like Apple's just catching up. Like the email thing, Gmail has had that for a while. Photos, Google Photos has had that for a while. What was the last thing you mentioned? The Playground.
Playground. And one other thing, there were a few other examples, nothing really mind-blowing, like the calculator thing was the coolest, but they also have some updates in Safari, where if you're reading an article, it'll automatically give you highlights of the article, and like I think it gives you a summary. So you're right, this is stuff that like has been in many apps now, especially Google's apps. They've been doing this a lot, but Apple has been behind on putting AI features into these apps, and I think now they're doing it. And the advantage of that for users is that it's right there in the apps they already use, and they don't have to go elsewhere to do these AI workflows like you were talking about.
I guess they're very thoughtful about the implementation, and to your point, like the way it is done, it's a delightful experience. So it's also done in a very elegant way, right?
Yeah, that's true. And that's, I think, their unique strength and why customers love Apple. I use Apple myself. As a user, I love their products.
Yeah, there's this thing that Warren Buffett once said about an iPhone. It's like if someone paid you $10,000 to get rid of your iPhone, you still wouldn't do it. And which is why I think they're like Berkshire Hathaway is so heavily invested into Apple, and it's kind of like against like the diversification principle, but he still is okay with it and it's such a nice way of thinking about it, right? And that's true, right? Like if I gave you $10,000 never to use an iPhone again, I feel like you wouldn't take that money.
That's interesting. I actually have many reasons why I wish I didn't use an iPhone. There's many things I hate about Apple. Actually, we'll talk about them later in this episode. The way they lock you into a closed system and don't let you choose alternatives. I think philosophically, my company Meta is just like very opposed to Apple's view on this. And
you're perhaps not the right person to ask this question, but like a normal person who
but I'm just saying, consider that despite all that, I'm still using the iPhone just because of the lock-in and the convenience. Like I use a Mac for work, and then I got one of these Apple Watches many years ago.
That's actually interesting. That is such a good point. Like despite that, you're still in the ecosystem. That proves Warren Buffett's point.
It's just like ecosystem lock-in. So for me to switch out, I would love to go and try an Android phone, but it's going to be so disruptive to my workflow. My watch won't sync with it. I have these AirPods that work well with the iPhone, and then it syncs between my Mac and So once you kind of get into the ecosystem, it's hard to leave, and that's how they keep
interesting.
You, and that's
like so,
strategy.
The moat that Warren Buffett was explaining was more like brand love and just the passion that people have. But what you're explaining is the other side of it, which is just the lock-in aspect of the ecosystem. Everything just works so seamlessly. Interesting.
And I think they retain customers way better once the customers are using multiple Apple products and devices, because at that point it's just a huge inconvenience. And they also use a lot of proprietary tech that is not accessible to other people. So for example, the way the iPhone connects to the Apple Watch, no other watch manufacturer can have that level of integration because they have this deep hardware and software integration, and they don't expose that to third parties. In fact, there was recently a lawsuit about this. The Department of Justice in the US filed a lawsuit against Apple for being anti-competitive for exactly this reason. And one of the examples they cited was this. They said if somebody wants to compete in the watch market, it's really impossible because no one else can make a watch that's as good as Apple, because Apple just doesn't expose those APIs that Apple Watch uses to other companies. So I can never make another watch that'll
as you're
have...
saying this, I'm now reflecting back on what you said earlier about these companies like Humane and Rabbit wanting to make their own hardware is because they just couldn't do it on the iPhone, which would have been their preferred modality, right? Like they're just using an existing device as opposed to selling a new device, which is so difficult, right, to get people to switch, that they had to, because they don't have any options, right?
Yep. So let's table that. Let's spend a lot more time on that when we come back to discussing the implications
Okay, so coming
of this.
back to this, you said that they had two sets of phenomena. One set was integrating AI into already existing Apple apps like the calculator, photos, and mail. And what was the other? What was the other?
So again, this is my categorization. This is not how they framed it, but this is how I think is a relevant way for people to think about this distinction. The other one is AI in Siri. So Siri is becoming a really smart AI assistant that works across multiple apps. And here are some examples that they provided themselves. One example was they said you can say, "Hey Siri, send the photos from the barbecue on Saturday to Piyush." Sorry, this actually woke up my... I'll stop saying that word.
I don't have that problem because I'm an Android person.
But just repeating that, send the photos from the barbecue on Saturday to Piyush. So what that means is that the assistant is finding your photos that are relevant to the question, selecting the ones that are relevant, and then performing an action for you, which is sending them to you. And
so it's very contextually aware, like who Piyush is, and
and it's a workflow across multiple apps. So that's one example. Another example they gave was play the podcast that Jamie recommended. So we have to find out what podcast Jamie recommended. Maybe he sent you a message, a text message, or an email about this podcast, and you have to find out what that is, and then you have to perform an action.
You don't even have to mention like which app he recommended it on, like that. I mean, wow, that's cool. Like the Siri figures out Jamie and figures out all the way Jamie talks to you, because like we both talk on WhatsApp, but we also text, and then we email as well. So like
let's put aside the question of like third-party apps for now. That's a bigger question mark. Let's assume right now that all this is within Apple's app. So you're using iMessage to for your conversations, you're using Apple Mail for your emails, and you're using Apple Podcasts to listen to your podcast. So this stuff, what it can do is, since all these apps are Apple-owned apps and Apple has access to that data, they search through that data and find the relevant information to perform the relevant actions. So we talked about, and the last example, which is pretty cool, is, I mean, it's similar to this, but it says, when is mom's flight landing? And imagine you have to go pick up your mom at the airport. And I've often had to do this. If I have to pick up someone at the airport, I have to first go through my messages. Often it's on WhatsApp or somewhere, and I have to scroll a while to see where did they send me the info about their flight. And then I take that info, I copy it into like Google and look for like the flight status, and then I see the time. And then maybe I perform some other action after that, like I open Maps to navigate, or maybe I call an Uber or something like that. So it's kind of automated.
That resonates with me. Yeah, that's the same thing. Like whenever I have to go pick up my parents from the airport, like figuring out which terminal, which flight information, then I'll have to go back into my messages that we exchanged 3 or 4 months back when they shared the ticket or whatever, right? And that is such a hassle. So that's awesome.
So think about the reason why you can't do that with existing AI solutions. Like if you use ChatGPT to ask this question, it wouldn't work, right? Like because
it wouldn't know who my mom is. It wouldn't have history to like all my messages with my mom. Yeah.
So what Apple is saying is that this has your personal context. It has your personal data and your personal context, and it's using that. And last season we talked about AI agents, right? And they're based on having access to a knowledge base and then using that to get the relevant information and perform actions. So this is actually an AI agent. And it's the first, I think, full-fledged AI agent that consumers will have access to. And I think that's really cool, because so far the examples we've seen, like Rabbit, Humane, and others, just haven't worked. They haven't been useful because they didn't have access to the relevant information or the ability to perform the relevant actions. And both of these problems are being solved.
That's very interesting. Like, what you said, action. So far, all the action seems to be bringing up the information and displaying that.
No, remember we said when is mom's flight landing, right? So that you have to retrieve the information, which is like what's the flight number,
I understand.
the date.
So technically that's an action because it's a retrieval. But when you say action, I'm also thinking it's like booking
there's
Uber.
the second step of the action, which is looking it up on the flight status. Or we talked about other examples. It said send the photos from the barbecue on Saturday to Piyush. So sending photos is an action.
Yeah. Well, can it do stuff that Rabbit promised that Rabbit R1
yes,
could
so
do?
this is
like
actually this does exactly what Rabbit promised. Like I said, for now, let's put aside the question of third-party apps. If you're limited to Apple's apps, it can do everything. It's like the Rabbit R1. It realizes the promise that Rabbit made about the large action model. It's a large language model combined with retrieval augmented generation and action capabilities. So if you're limited to Apple apps, it can do all of that. It finds the relevant context and then it performs whatever actions you need. So yeah, I think this is kind of a huge moment in AI's iPhone moment because
it's so funny you said that. I was thinking the exact same thing. This is AI's iPhone moment being enabled by literally iPhone. It's so funny.
Yeah. But think back to the iPhone moment, right? We talked about that a few times in the past. The iPhone came out in 2007. And when the iPhone first launched, there was no concept of third-party apps. It was only first-party apps. You could only use apps that Apple provided. Then the iPhone moment really came about, or took off when third-party apps, with the App Store and with third-party apps. And that's when we had apps like Uber and Airbnb and Instagram and all of those really famous iPhone apps that.
I see now why you said earlier that you believe that this is like one of those and because I was surprised when you said that. It's like, oh wow, that's saying a lot, right? That this is a big thing for the whole ecosystem. And I can see what you mean now. Like, this is the iPhone moment of the AI enabled by Apple by building it into the iPhone. Wow.
But it's still questionable because as we said, in the iPhone, the entire power of that came from third-party apps. Like, if there are no third-party apps, there would be no iPhone moment. Like, if the world of the iPhone was limited to only things that Apple made, it would be like a fraction as useful, like 1% maybe.
But I'm assuming because they announced it in Dub, as you said, and that one's targeted more for the developers, I'm assuming that they also now...
So let's talk about the third-party integrations now. So in this example, we said, when is mom's flight landing? And if the information was in messages or mail, Apple can go fetch that information and find the flight number. But what if you got this text on WhatsApp? We both use WhatsApp a lot. Like in India, almost everyone uses it. How will Apple find that information? For that, Apple is releasing their own API. It's called the App Intents API, and third-party developers have to integrate with that API if they want their applications to work with Siri and work with the AI assistant. So, if the information is in Gmail or it's in WhatsApp, right now that's not going to be useful to me as a consumer. On Google and Meta decide to start connecting their apps and their data to this API.
Wow, interesting. How help me understand, do you know how it would work? Like, in my mind, I'm envisioning like a rack type system where if a third party developer gave Apple access to this API, it would like somehow enrich the prompt or add to the context, whatever's available only within that third-party ecosystem.
Yeah, so that's exactly how it works. Regardless of whether it's first-party or third-party apps, the overall architecture is like that. When you make a request to the assistant, sorry, I have to prevent myself from saying the word. When you make a request to the assistant, it has to first go and figure out which apps and which relevant actions can be called, or they're called intents here instead of actions. And then intent,
INTENT, not intense.
No, yeah, it's like I intend to do this. This is my intention. So it's about translating a user's request into intentions and actions. So one of the intentions is like search and retrieval. So the first thing you need to do is search and retrieval, find the relevant information, and then suppose you have to send a message, then the intent is something like send message. And Apple, their iMessage will obviously expose that functionality to Siri because it's their own app. But whether WhatsApp and Gmail decide to expose that functionality to Siri depends on decisions they make about whether they want to integrate with this API or not.
That's very interesting. Wow. So that could enable the iPhone moment of AI, right? Like if a lot of developers start building and using the Apple Intents API.
It absolutely could. So maybe let's get to that question. Before that, let's dive a little deeper into the architecture. I think you had a good question about how does this work? Is this like a retrieval augmented generation system? So I have another visual I want to share. I found this from a user on Threads called CS Pen. I don't know who this is, but he provided like a pretty good architecture diagram of how this works.
Why are you blowing that up? Are there people who are exclusively on Threads and not on other Twitter-like things? I'm curious.
I have no idea. I don't like using Twitter. I never got into it. I just search it sometimes. I got into Threads because
you're
obviously...
You're a great Meta employee. I hope Mark Zuckerberg listens to this podcast at some point. Like, Mark, if you're ever listening, like this guy needs to be your like second in command or something. Like he loves Meta and he's like one of the smartest people I know, if not the smartest.
I would be honored if Zuck ever chose to listen to this podcast.
What are we looking at?
Okay, we're looking at the architecture.
And also just describe it as keep going.
Right. Yeah, let's describe it. This is the architecture of Apple Intelligence. I don't know actually if this is an official diagram that they provided or if this was made by this guy on Threads. In either case, I think it's sufficient for our purposes. It explains generally how this stuff works. So the way it starts is first, it's the request originates with a system-wide experience. In this case, let's talk about the AI assistant. And you provide a request to the assistant. You say something like, when is mom's flight landing?
Right.
And then
that would be the equivalent of a prompt.
Yeah. It's the equivalent of a prompt. So that's the request. And then what it does is it looks up this thing called the App Intents Toolbox, where it's looking at what are the relevant intents that could help with this task. And it simultaneously, it's also looking up a knowledge base that's called a semantic index here. So they are building up a personal knowledge base about you in this thing called a semantic index, which is basically, my understanding is that this is a vector database that stores vector representations of some text about you. This could be information retrieved from your messages, from your personal information, and so on. So that's the retrieval part. And my guess is that if the information...
hold on. I wanna make sure that we're going through this a little bit slowly so I can like reflect on what you're saying. And so semantic index, as I understand, is Apple's understanding of your context in some sense.
Yes, of your personal context.
On your personal context. App Intents Toolbox. Help me understand what that is.
App Intents Toolbox is all the actions that apps can take. So the Mail app will have some, let's just call them actions instead of intents, just to be clear.
Got it.
Mail will have actions like search, send, reply, those kind of things. So
are these things an abstract version of actions, or are they specific to apps? So for example, would Gmail send be action separate from Apple's Mail send, or is this like a more abstracted version of
It's a more abstracted version. So they provide some predefined intents And then each app can develop their own custom ones if they want. So if it's something like send email, that'll be probably a general action that many apps can use. But if there's something that's hyper specific to your individual app, then you can define a custom intent for that.
Got it.
So based on your request, the assistant is breaking that down into its components parts and trying to find the relevant information and retrieve like the relevant actions that are needed. And then, so there are three layers.
Is interesting. Sorry again. I apologize. I'll keep interrupting you because this is fascinating, by the way. So, if you take a simplistic understand of RAG, which stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation, so far the retrieval was like one thing, but now there's like two categories of retrieval. There's your semantic retrieval, which is an understanding of you, and then there is a retrieval of the relevant actions based on the prompt or based on the system-wide experience.
It's probably also semantic ultimately, because the actions will have descriptions, and it's probably going to be looking for which action is most closely similar to the request that you provided.
But what I'm trying to get at is like a fundamentally different type of thing that gets retrieved.
That's right. And that's why, like, when the Rabbit founder released Rabbit R1, he was talking a lot about how there's this new thing called the large action model, the LAM, and how that is specifically trained to perform actions. This is a version of that, basically. This searches through the list of possible actions from Apple's own apps and actions that have been exposed by third-party apps to find the relevant actions.
It's very cool.
And the models that are being used to do all of this, so there are a couple of different options here. So one is their on-device models. So Apple has made their own on-device models.
Did Apple invent a foundational model, much like a Gemini and a GPT?
Yeah. So basically what we discovered through this announcement was, yes, they've been working on their own foundation. I mean, I don't know if you would call it a foundation model, but these are large language models, essentially. And they have two flavors of these. There are some models that can run on device. That means they're small enough that can fit on your phone. It has enough memory and processing power to run those models.
Something like a Gemini Nano, right? Which is like an on-device.
I forgot what it's called, like Flash or Nano. Yeah, something like that. So that can run on device. It can run small workloads. And then they also have larger models that they've developed that are going to be running on what's called the Apple Private Cloud. So that's the second layer. So what it'll do is it'll decide whether, based on the complexity of the action, the amount of context that needs to be processed, whether that can be processed by an on-device model or whether it needs to be sent to the Apple private cloud to be processed by a server model.
That's very interesting, but which entity is deciding that?
Yeah, so there's an on-device model that must be doing this orchestration. So it's called the orchestration in this diagram.
So that should be different from the on-device. So the thing that's deciding if it should be using an on-device LLM model or an on-server LLM model, that thing is separate from the on-device LLM model, or is it?
It's separate. You can think, like, we don't know the exact details of this, and we probably never will. This is proprietary to Apple, but at a high level, we can infer that sounds about right. That's a good way to conceptualize it. So think of it as a multi-agent workflow. So there's one orchestrator agent. What that agent is doing is taking the task, and then maybe the orchestrator agent spins up two other agents. One is a retriever agent, says go retrieve from the semantic index what context we can get, what data and information we can get that's relevant to this. Maybe there's an intent finder agent that goes and retrieves the relevant intents or actions.
Can you use an example maybe that we talked about before? So let's take the example of
when is mom's flight?
Yeah.
When is mom's flight landing, right?
So mom would come from the semantic index, and retrieval of flight information perhaps would come from
first this would have to be broken down into multiple different questions. So you would have to break it down into a question like, who is mom? And then it would have to be broken down into like, what flight is mom on? And then the next question would be, what time is that flight arriving? So the first thing that has to be done is a breakdown of the relevant questions for any multi-agent system. That's a typical flow. So once it's broken down, probably what it's doing is it's assigning the right agents for each of those tasks. So for who is mom, that information is probably retrieved from the semantic index, which has information about my contacts and information we got from my mail and messages and so on. So it retrieves that mom corresponds to so-and-so. And then the next question is like, when is mom's flight? So this is where you have to search across your mail and messages. So if you didn't specify where this information came from, probably it has to find all the places where this information might be. That includes mail, messages. And so depending on how many messages you have and how many seem relevant, if there are only a small number of messages retrieved that seem relevant to this question, probably it could do this computation on device. And,
got it. Okay.
Probably if you retrieved like a large number of emails, and then it cannot be done on device, then it would send it to the server, and that's where it gets processed. So
that makes a lot of sense.
Depending on the workload, it's either on device or in the server. And this is where the privacy angle comes in, because if something is done on device, that means your data is totally private. It's never leaving your device. Your data, the messages, the raw data itself is on your device. Actually, it's not clear. Depending on if you have iCloud Sync enabled, then your messages and mail could also be on.
No, but I get your point. The processing of that is done on device. Like maybe you'll get some data from your iCloud, but
so this index,
inferencing of that will happen on device.
Yes, and the index is stored on your device. If it's done on device, it's totally private. There's no risk of your data being leaked to any third party. So, but in the second case, if it decides that this task is too complex and I have to go and run a model on the server to answer this question, then it does what's called a Apple private cloud. And that it's not entirely clear what it is, but what they're claiming is that it's a version of cloud computation which is as secure as on device. They say that as soon as your data is processed, it's like immediately deleted after that. And I think they're using this concept of a trusted execution environment where they can, they've published externally verifiable papers that other people can prove that this is actually what's happening over there. So I don't understand like the details of the cryptographic protocols involved here, but there are ways to externally verify that what you're saying is happening is actually happening without looking into the data itself. So I think...
Yeah, there's a concept. This is reminding me of a concept from the blockchain ecosystem. It's something like a zero trust. I forget the name of it, but it has a zero in it.
It could be zero trust. But they're all based on some cryptographic protocols which enable you to verify something without actually looking into that thing that you're verifying. Like passwords, for example.
I know about this concept. The founder of Ethereum, his name is Vitalik Buterin. I don't know if you've heard of this guy. He's like a genius, right? Like you can actually see his body's energy being used up by his big brain. Anyways, like that, he was talking about this whole idea of like validating and proving something without revealing what that thing is, and there was some innovation in that in the blockchain ecosystem. So I have an intuition for what you're talking about.
Okay, so that's what's going on in the Apple private cloud. So either the task is small enough that they can do it on device, your data never goes anywhere else, or the task is sufficiently complex that it needs to be running on the server model, in which case it goes to Apple's private cloud. And I guess like coming back to this meme and Elon's question.
I was just going to say that. What's Elon Musk's problem with this?
Yeah. So there's one part of this that is not represented in this diagram, and that's OpenAI. So if Apple determines that this question cannot be answered neither on device nor on its private cloud with its own models, then it will send the query to OpenAI, to a third-party model, but only with your permission. So it'll always prompt you. It'll say, hey, we're going to send this query to OpenAI. Can we do that or not? And you will have to say, okay.
Every time, or is it like a blanket approval that, hey, we might?
It's unclear right now what kind of settings they'll offer. Maybe it will be every time. Hopefully there will be some blanket approval.
That makes sense now. So like Elon Musk's worry is that data going to OpenAI. Well, actually, I'm curious about this. If I'm prompting something to ChatGPT, I have two questions.
Mm-hmm. Here, I'm going to stop sharing this. I think we don't need it anymore. We can keep talking.
So I have two questions about this.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm talking to ChatGPT, one, is my prompt completely private, like how WhatsApp has end-to-end encryption, meaning WhatsApp has no visibility into the chat between Nikhil and Piyush, right? Mm-hmm. End-to-end encryption. And number two, if it's not, then could the LLM foundational model, or in this case GPT-4 or 4.0, learn from what I asked in the prompt?
Okay, yeah, so let's go through these step by step. The first question you asked, it's kind of complicated because you gave the example of in WhatsApp, your chat between Nikhil and Piyush is encrypted, and that means that nobody other than Nikhil and Piyush can read that. But in this case, your chat is between you and ChatGPT. So ChatGPT is the other person. Yeah, I guess that's a
wrong analogy. What I'm trying to say is, like, does OpenAI discard my prompt once it's been used? Or like,
no, they have different levels of plans that they offer. There's the free plan, and then there's a consumer pro plan, and then there's an enterprise plan. I think, as far as I know, only the enterprise plan has the guarantee that your data will not be used for training their models. If normal consumer plans, whatever info you're sharing with OpenAI, they are absolutely saving all of that, and they use that as further training data for their models. And not only is it that they're using it as training data, it just exposes you to a security risk that if somebody hacks OpenAI servers at some point in future, like, your data could be breached as a result of that hack.
Interesting. And when you say that OpenAI could potentially use my prompt for training data,
they will definitely use it. It's not could potentially. Yeah.
Do you mean that in the next training batch for GPT-5, or do you mean that when the model runs an inference? And by the way, I don't know what running an inference is. At some point, I would like to understand that.
Okay, but it's really simple. Running an inference is just like getting a model output. That's all it means.
Okay, so my question is, in doing so, does the model digest it and update the foundational?
No, it's not immediate. Like, you're just interacting with a pre-trained model.
Okay, so nothing happens to its knobs and dials or the parameters?
Not in the moment. It's just later as they go through the next iteration, when they're like, we're making GPT 4.5 or 5 or something, they'll be informed by this data. But I think maybe, I don't know if I would be so worried about my data being used to train that model. I mean, sure, that could be concerning, but I think the bigger risk is that just your data is there sitting on their server somewhere, and it's just there. You know, it could be misused. If somebody hacks OpenAI, they would get access to it. They could further misuse that data. So there are both of these risks, I guess. They're
Elon
both.
Musk's worry that if the orchestrator decides to send this request from an Tesla employee potentially to OpenAI, Tesla is vulnerable to OpenAI, one, having access to Tesla employees' prompt data, and two,
and whatever
OpenAI
context.
Training the next models on said data.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, I don't know how much sense it makes. Tesla employees are probably already using OpenAI and ChatGPT. Sure. So this is a legitimate concern, but I think it's based on a misunderstanding that by default Apple is going to do this, and as we just saw, that's the third step and the last resort. Let's think about like how often this may happen. Like we don't have any data, but if I were to guess, I would use this like 80-20 rule, and I'd say first you figure out, can it be handled on device or not?
Right.
Maybe 80% of requests are handled on device, and 20% are sent off device. And then out of the off device requests, probably 80% of those can be handled by Apple's private cloud. Only 20% of those are sent to OpenAI. So 20% times 20%, that's like 4. Let's play the devil's
advocate here on the 80-20. I completely agree with you. But one could also make an argument that the types of requests that you'd be most worried about not sharing are maybe the more complicated ones that would largely be representative of the ones that go to a third-party model.
Okay, let's actually talk about what goes to a third-party model. Apple actually hasn't been very explicit about what determines this decision. One of the main things they've been talking about in their presentations on this is that if your question only needs personal knowledge, you don't need to send that outside. But if your question needs world knowledge to answer, then they'll send it to an external third-party model provider like ChatGPT. So if you're asking some general knowledge, and actually I think it's inverse then, it's less likely that personal questions that involve your sensitive data are going to be sent out, because that's more for like things that require world knowledge.
Is OpenAI the first partner to have been offered this option, or is it an exclusive partnership, or could tomorrow Google's Gemini be one of those models that the orchestrators like all now figure out like which is the best third-party model?
That's a good question. We don't know the details, but here's what we do know. There was a lot of speculation before about who's paying who in this relationship. Is Apple paying OpenAI, or is OpenAI paying Apple? And I think now mostly the consensus is that it's not, that Apple is definitely not paying OpenAI for this, that it's either happening.
Yeah, OpenAI should be grateful that all Apple devices are now there. Like Google pays, I don't know if you know this, Google pays billions of dollars to Apple for Apple to set Google search as the default search engine.
Yeah, this is a very famous thing. In fact, I think it's something like $20 billion, and it corresponds
called a traffic acquisition cost in the industry, and it's in the order of magnitude of tens of billions of dollars. So you're right.
And actually, what's more interesting is that it corresponds to about 30% of the revenue that Google generates from that search traffic that's coming.
Yeah, because I work in Google Ads. I know a lot of things. But I can obviously share. But you're right. Like, I mean, think about it. Apple users are presumably slightly more wealthy than Android users, just because of the range of Android prices, right? So in the world of digital advertising, which you're also a part of, a lot of the buys happens on the potential of the audience or their wallet, right? So like that makes sense, and that's why Google is willing to pay so much money. So let's just leave it at that.
No, I agree with that. I think in this case, that may very well be the case, actually, that Apple shopped this around to various people and took the highest bidder.
I wouldn't be surprised if OpenAI is paying for a service that Apple is using. Because Google that's what it's doing, right? Google's providing a search service to Apple's users and paying for it. That's Apple.
True. But I mean, Google is monetizing that, right? I think the main difference is that like OpenAI doesn't really have a good way like Google of monetizing these queries.
Not yet. But they have distribution now.
Yes,
like at the scale of Apple.
So actually, you're right.
You said consensus, meaning no one knows what's going on.
I meant the consensus of expert opinions on this, I think, is more aligned with what you're saying, that definitely people believe that Apple is not paying OpenAI. That's not happening here. It's quite likely that OpenAI is paying Apple for this, for the distribution rights. I don't know why they would be doing that. I'm not sure. It will be interesting to see what is their monetization model.
Branding, right? Like it just, look, we're answering what Apple can't answer. Like that's a great storyline, right? Yeah.
But it's coming at a huge cost because they're paying for all the requests that are coming from the Apple users.
Yeah, maybe some smart people have done the cost-benefit analysis that having your brand being positioned like that for like in front of the world, or being part of this AI's iPhone moment, or enabling that just is worth it.
But one thing that is very clear is that Apple 100% has the clear upper hand in this relationship between Apple and OpenAI.
They own the orchestrator.
Yeah. And they only, even if you look at how this happened in the presentation, they literally mentioned it just at the very end as an afterthought after they went through all of their AI and the AI assistant and on-device and private cloud. And at the very end, they said, and for some queries that require world knowledge, we're going to send them to OpenAI. And they also clearly said that this is not exclusive, that in future, they will also be integrating other third-party model providers. And for example, Sam Altman was invited to this event and he was like tweeting from there, but he was never invited on stage to come and talk about this partnership or anything like that. So
yeah, maybe that's because he's apparently been in talks with John Ivey. You know, the British guy who used to come
Johnny
for all
Ive.
Yeah, oh yeah, sorry, my bad. Yeah, Johnny Ive, and presumably they're working on some kind of a competitor to the iPhone, right? So
that's possible.
I mean, one thing that definitely can be said is this is such an interesting space that's like developing in front of our eyes, and yeah, it's just the way it's blowing up. All right, let's come back to the iPhone
implications.
Moment. Yeah, the implications, right? That's why I'm coming back. So first of all, thank you so much. The architecture is now like, I have a good intuition for what's happening under the hood, and I also understand what Elon Musk's apprehensions were. But I want to come back to like what you said. It kind of caught my attention. Is you think that this is a big thing for the ecosystem?
Yeah.
So like coming back to like the art and science, I feel like you did such a good job of explaining the science of it, like the under the hood. So what, like as a business or as a developer, like what's the art of how do I use this? Or I don't know, like what is the art behind? Like what is the art of this now?
Yeah, so in terms of how you can use this, right? Let's think about it from two perspectives. First is the end user, and second is like the rest of the ecosystem. For end users, this is like a great step forward. And like I said, it's probably a key turning point in AI's iPhone moment. But for almost everyone else in the AI ecosystem, it's probably really bad news. Let's talk about why this is great. I think you can differentiate between 3 levels of AI. Each of which is better than the previous level. The first is like a standalone freestanding AI, which is like a ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, where you go and just have a chat experience with it. It has no context about you, your workflow, or anything like that. So that's like the most basic form of AI. Second is AI integrated into specific applications. So like we saw these examples of the calculator app, the mail app. In that case, it's better than the freestanding version because it has context of that specific application. If I'm writing an email, it has that email. It probably has my previous emails. It has all that context, so it's more powerful. But still, it doesn't...
Context only limited to that particular app.
Yes, exactly. So the holy grail of like making AI useful and a true AI assistant is an AI assistant that's integrated into your overall workflow and knowledge base. Like that's a real AI assistant. And that's what companies like Rabbit and Humane were trying to deliver, but failed.
Why is Google sleeping on this? They had Google Assistant, which is like, I don't understand. Like they invented the T in ChatGPT. Sundar announced that Google's going to be an AI first company in 2016. Like why isn't this...
That actually is a bit odd. There were rumors earlier about something called Pixie, Pixie, that Google was supposed to release for Android. That's very similar to this. But I don't doubt that Google will very soon release something like this. I don't think it...
I would love to see that. Like this would be so great for the ecosystem. And I love Android. I love Google. Like I want to see this same thing being done by other players as well.
Well, let's talk about like why this is actually potentially a bad thing. Let me start by talking about how
what is a bad thing. Like other Google also doing
the negative implications for it. So first of all, we talked about the fact that no one else can do this. Like if I'm a company and I decide, oh, I have a great idea for an AI assistant, there's no way for me to do that. Apple just won't let any other AI assistant do this. So the only entity that can have access to the semantic index and these workflows is Siri. No one else gets access to that. So it is fundamentally a closed model. It's a closed system.
Right.
And that is something that I think is concerning. Actually, before we get into this in more detail, I want to play another video clip about some of the concerns regarding closed models. Give me one sec.
Yeah, but I see what you're saying. Yeah, that makes sense.
Give me one sec. Let's find this one.
The only say that the third-party apps
this
have
is
this
a
API.
podcast interview that Mark Zuckerberg did with Dwarkesh Patel. It's a pretty cool podcast. This was about a month or so ago. And here's what he says about open versus closed systems.
Efficient development, it could enable qualitatively different things. Here's one analogy on this is so one thing that I think generally sucks about the mobile ecosystem is that like you have these two gatekeeper companies, Apple and Google, that can tell you what you're allowed to build. And there are lots of times in our history, so there's the economic version of that, which is like, all right, we build something and they're just like, I'm going to take a bunch of your money. But then there's the qualitative version, which is actually what kind of upsets me more, which is there's a bunch of times when we've launched or wanted to launch features, and then Apple's just like, nope, you're not launching that. It's like, that sucks, right? And so the question is, what is, like, are we kind of set up for a world like that with AI, where like you're going to get a handful of companies that run these closed models that are going to be in control of the APIs and therefore going to be able to tell you what you can build? Well, for one,
wow, that is so efficient.
It is.
I can stop there. So
that is so efficient. I was saying like what he said. If he said this just a month before the announcement, I mean, being in his position, he probably had an intuition that this is about to come. But yeah, that is so relevant to just literally what we talked about. What he said
is this closed model. There are a handful of companies that control the models, and more importantly, that control the closed APIs that everyone else has to just use. If you either follow their rules or you don't get to exist. And I think this is the fundamental problem with these closed systems. And this is something that Zuck has been he didn't even need to know about this announcement. If you just understand Apple's philosophy, it was like always obvious that this is how they're going to do it. Like, just think of examples in the past. Like, this is my frustration with the iPhone. Like, you can't choose your default apps. Like, I love using Google Maps, for example, instead of Apple Maps.
Really?
But yeah.
You couldn't set Google Maps as default because Apple Maps sucks.
I mean, default has multiple aspects to it, but there's some privileged access that only Apple Maps gets. For example, if you're navigating somewhere and your phone is locked, it'll show you the navigation on your lock screen. But that privilege no other app can have, only Apple Maps. So if I use Google Maps, that means I have to give up this like quality of life feature. Similarly, like they privilege their own like photos over like Google Photos or other apps. So in general, it's a closed model. They don't.
Right.
They have their own integrations.
It's anti-competitive. It's not good for the end consumer.
I agree with this, but I do also want to provide the other side of the argument, just to be fair to Apple and
the privacy angle.
Yeah, which is privacy and security, which is that if they open this up and they said Rabbit can make their own assistant app, or let's even take the example of like OpenAI can make their own assistant app that can do all the stuff Siri can, that presents a pretty large risk to Apple that your personal private data is being used by OpenAI and stored on their servers. And
no, that's such a good point. And I wanna be very balanced in this podcast. You said some very nice things about Meta, and I know you love Meta, but there was a time where that Cambridge Analytica scandal happened, and essentially it was just a leakage of private data, and people used that to like manipulate people's intuitions and drive consent or whatever. So having this semantic understanding and like is so powerful, and if the wrong third-party app had access to it, I can't even imagine what it would be like. Like back when Cambridge Analytica we didn't have LLMs, so we just had certain data points, and it was more statistical. But now it's more semantic, and
I agree. This is a huge
solution to this. This is I see both sides.
I mean, my preferred solution is give users the choice. If I'm fine with accepting the risks of my data going to OpenAI, I should be allowed to do that. And you can set as a default that, look, by default, you can't do this. You can only use Apple's solution, but provide me the option. Bury it somewhere in settings and say, hey, if you click this option is really, really dangerous, please don't click this option. you can put whatever text you want, but like I still want that option to click that button and
like
say,
cigarette, basically.
is
You're
my
saying
data,
apply
like,
the same philosophy that's
I
applied
want to take
cigarette.
the risk. Sorry, same philosophy as what?
Cigarettes basically has like a
cigarettes,
like a very obvious warning, like a graphic warning, right? So you're saying something on the similar lines. Let's just make it very obvious that this is going to send the, like, it's going to basically send an understanding of what you are as a person to this third party. Are you okay with that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, recently, Microsoft, I mean, I think the general theme I'm trying to make here is that AI assistants are kind of dead, and no one else can do this except the operating system and ecosystem like controllers. That's Apple, Google, Microsoft. So there are these three big companies that are going to be in control of this. Historically, desktop platforms have been more open and mobile platforms have been more closed. But recently there was an incident. So Microsoft had their own version of an AI event a few weeks ago where they announced something kind of similar, though a little less sophisticated. It's called Copilot PCs. So they introduced a new line of hardware which has a bunch of on-device AI and machine learning on it. And one of the things that it does is this feature called Recall, where it remembers everything you're doing on your device. It periodically takes some screenshots, and then you can ask it questions like, oh, last week I was browsing this website, remind me what website that was. Or like, yesterday I was on a call with this person, remind me what time this was, what happened in that call, those kind of things.
Right.
And they recently got hacked, I think. Some of that data got breached. Imagine this is like very private data. Like if it's taking screenshots, maybe I was entering my password in that screenshot.
Right.
Maybe I was having my financial institution or like some health record like on my screen at the time, and they were capturing this data. And for whatever reason, they didn't implement good security practices. So anyway, now they rolled that back. Previously, it was on by default, and now they've made it an explicit opt-in. And also, I suspect as a result of this, what's going to happen is that they're going to lock down that access and say only Microsoft can access this data and use So I think we've been focusing a lot on the data part, but this control applies not just to data, it's also to like the control of the actions. I can't... I can't make a third-party assistant that can compete with Siri. Apple just won't allow that. So again, going back to the question about Rabbit and Humane, they could have just said, hey, let me make an assistant. And even if they say, look, I don't want to use any personal data, just let me do some actions, let me perform actions for the user. Apple doesn't allow that. I think Google is slightly more open than Apple with Android, but even they are pretty strict about this. Yeah, I think we're actually heading to the world that like Zuck was describing, which is that AI is just further entrenching the power of the large players that control the existing ecosystem, and it's just going to make them more powerful, I think. And some of the implications of that are, one, it's the commodification of models. So now you can see that model providers are becoming almost irrelevant. Apple talked about how there's ChatGPT with OpenAI. That's one provider. Soon there'll be others. Probably there'll be some open source options and many others. And really the user interface is being controlled by Apple. And that's just something that's happening on the back end. So they're making it irrelevant. They're making the thing that's prominent is your user experience and interaction with Siri. And the model is just like, some back end like stuff. You don't need to worry about that.
Right.
I think that's a clear threat. And this is something...
Why is that a threat? Why is that a bad thing that the models are commodified? Like, is commodification inherently a bad thing?
Yes. For the companies that are getting commodified, it is a bad thing, because if you're a commodity, that means you're undifferentiated, and then like you can't charge, you have no pricing power, you have no market power.
But it's good for the consumer, no? Like maybe it's and maybe you can innovate on like a computational power, or I don't know, like making it cheaper or something. Yeah, I see why it could be bad.
I agree with this. No, I didn't mean it's bad. So I started by saying I think this is great for consumers, just bad for other people in the ecosystem. So model providers is one. And we talked about this even in the last season, which is that I don't think there's like a defensible competitive moat you can build around being a model provider. Even if you're at the cutting edge, your main advantage is like, oh, I'm 6 months or 12 months ahead of the other guys, because the other guys are going to catch up with you in 6 to 12 months.
Yeah.
There's not much differentiation in models now.
So what is the opportunity here then for budding entrepreneurs or for aspirants in the ecosystem?
Yeah, actually, if you're talking about doing something specifically with AI, I think this is bad news.
Let me be more specific in my question. So they announced this in WW, as you said, it's meant for developers. What is the opportunity for me? And I'm fine. Like there's things which I can control, things which I can't control, and there are things that are just beyond me, right? Like this whole this ecosystem war and all of that is beyond me. But can I do something as an entrepreneur based on these announcements?
Okay, so let's think about if you're an app developer, you have some popular app on the App Store right now. The main decision that you're faced with now is, should I integrate with Apple Intelligence or not? That's the main thing you have to decide right now. And I think it will be really interesting to see the decisions that various app developers are making in this regard, because so far, most apps have been providing their own AI solutions within the product, and they've been trying to like upsell that as an add-on. Often it's like, oh, you have to pay a few dollars extra to get this AI. So, there's like Notion AI, there's Adobe Acrobat AI, there's AI in so many apps. And what they're saying is that, look, we will make this app like AI for you and you pay us a little extra. I think that's probably going away now, because,
really?
Whether or not it's going away depends.
It'll stay for some, like for Adobe, for example, it's such a nuanced thing. It'll maybe stay because editing images or videos with AI.
Oh, sorry. I was talking about Adobe Acrobat AI, which is for the PDFs.
And what's the feature that it enables?
It enables you to chat with your PDFs. You can ask questions. You can say, if you store all,
I agree with you. I think that's going to go away.
You store all your PDFs in Acrobat.
Siri, what am I looking at? Like, hey Siri, help me summarize what I'm looking at, or something like that. Which is a much, what was the word you used? Delightful user experience than opening that thing from Acrobat and whatever modality Acrobat provides for you to ask.
And also things like Notion AI, like again, all this text-based stuff, right? Where the people are providing. So what is Notion AI doing? Notion AI enables you to find relevant notes. You can chat with your notes. And second, it enables you to have better writing experiences. You can say, improve this draft that I'm writing. Now Apple is putting that at the operating system level, and it's saying, hey, Notion, you just need to expose your data and actions to us to let this happen. So I'm actually really curious to see Notion, are they going to connect with Apple Intelligence or not? If they do, they can't continue charging $10 a month or whatever they are for Notion AI, because that doesn't make any sense. So and there's a whole like ecosystem of this, like so many apps have started offering their own AI capabilities. So on the one hand, I do think for consumers, it's better to have it in a somewhat centralized place, because I want to have maybe a uniform experience and I want to be able to connect. If it's Notion AI that's siloed, suppose I want to say something like, hey, find my recent meeting notes with Piyush and send an email summary to someone else. Those kind of workflows are not possible if it's just an app level AI. So this is great for consumers, but I don't know what's going to happen, whether the apps will...
It'll be very interesting to see, you're right, what will happen, like how many apps or businesses end up exposing their data both to the semantic and the action layer within Apple Intelligence. Yeah.
Because every app wants to control the user interface ultimately. So think about an example like in my company, right, in Meta, like Instagram. Instagram would never expose this functionality. If you can just say to Apple, hey, get me the last 10 photos shared by my friends and show them to me.
No one's going to watch the ads, right?
Exactly. That makes no sense. They wouldn't do that. I think this story is not new to AI. This has been happening a lot. One recent example was Apple TV. They made a decision to try to plug in content from everywhere. So they asked all the other app developers on Apple TV, hey, can you expose your content to this? There's some central Apple TV app that could search across different libraries. So suppose you have like Netflix installed, you have HBO installed, and you have some other apps.
Such a good thing, because it's annoying because I have to go inside the app. Like I would rather have a universal thing that just, I mean, I'll pay for these services, but just give me a universal interface where.
So that's great for consumers, but Netflix actually famously was one of the ones that chose to not adopt that. And they're like, hey, we want our customers to come to our app, engage with our service, because we think we can find the right recommendations for our customers. Right. Maybe we want to show them some ads now that they have an ad-supported plan. So they completely lose control.
Let's say even if Apple agreed to like use their recommendation engine or whatever, give it full integration, there is some value in like controlling the user experience, right? Like you want that. I see that.
Think about another example is Tesla. Tesla does not integrate with Apple CarPlay or Android Auto. You can only use their onboard experience, because they understand that like you're ceding control to Apple or Google more and more. Like whoever controls the user interface, the rest of it becomes commoditized. It becomes the back end. It becomes something I don't care about. And actually the CarPlay example is interesting because Apple CarPlay is trying to do more and more. They're trying to convince auto manufacturers to expose functionality like fuel gauges and like all these other controls, system level controls, like maybe air conditioning and things like that, which previously you couldn't do with Apple CarPlay. And they want to integrate that and provide some standard API interface for that. But it's always a question. So Apple is like the giant in the room. They're the aggregator. They aggregate all the user front end and they control the user relationship. So you lose power the moment you give up everything to this like centralized entity. You no longer have a relationship with your customers. But then the
risk over there is because of like the people who integrate might not have as good of a product as you do, but because of the integration with Apple and the delightful experience that enables, that might just be enough for the consumer to be like, I don't care. I mean, it's slightly better, but I would much rather have this delightful experience. So it's but
the delightful experience is provided by Apple, right? And then
that's what I'm saying. I'm saying there are maybe other businesses who are willing to expose their data to Apple, and then the people who hold out can't. I mean, it's a tricky situation. So I'm agreeing with you that it's a very, very tricky situation, and I don't know what the game theory of this, how the game theory of this will play out, but
it's like a game theoretical thing, because you lose your like differentiation when you do it. So suppose I become very reliant on Apple for my notes. And I'm like, Notion is this back-end place where I capture my notes. But when I need to do something interesting, I ask the Apple assistant, Siri, to summarize my notes. Then in the future, I might be like, I can just switch out Notion with any other notes app, or I can just switch out.
I mean, Notion would at the end just become like a place where you're typing. Like that's a commodified app.
Or like, Adobe Acrobat. Like I'm like, okay, I can just switch out Acrobat for any other PDF app. So they start... it's a shift in the value chain where the front end that controls the user experience is getting more and more of the value, and that's what Apple is doing right now. So I don't know. I think these are kind of interesting.
That's a very interesting framework. Maybe that's interesting. Value chain of AI.
I think that's an interesting. We can do a deep dive episode on that at some point. We talked about it earlier, like starting from GPUs all the way to like cloud to apps and to like finally
we should
the
do that.
devices.
At some point, we should deep dive into the value chain of AI.
I think that would be a great episode. I know that we already have a couple of episodes planned.
This has been so insightful. Like we started with that meme, but it's just so interesting where this is all headed. I'm so excited to just see how this all plays out over the next few months. And a lot of this
is not specific to AI. It's just questions of like platforms and ecosystems, aggregation that is cyclical. It keeps repeating. And I think people thought that with AI, it's going to be different. It's going to produce opportunities for like new people to come up and disrupt the existing giants. But I think what we've been seeing based on what's happening is that it's the opposite, that it's actually a way for the entrenched like players to further become even more dominant. So I don't know.
Well, I have
we'll have
faith
to
in
see.
Zuck as a challenger. Is like they're going to create a new modality, right? Like with the
he actually
the
talks
whole
about
company's name on it, right? Like it's called Meta now. So I mean that's an interesting idea. So we'll see how that plays out, and then
I'll add this podcast that he did with Varkesh to the references, but he talks about that in detail. And after this segment that we heard, he talks about how there's always a balance between open and closed systems. Like in the 90s and 2000s, in the desktop era, we had open systems that were more common. Then in the mobile era, the closed model became popular. And he's like, well, we don't know what the next platform will be. And he's like, if we control it, we want that to be an open platform. But yeah, I don't know. Like even if they do, like it's possible that Zuck will realize that, hey, there's just so much, like being too open has a high cost for like privacy and security, but maybe it's more like degrees of openness. It's not like a binary thing, but Apple is definitely like super closed. They do stuff that's not just security and privacy.
Actually, that's a good point. We shouldn't like judge and attribute malintent. It's just that we don't know what goes into making these decisions, and there's so many things to consider. So it's just, I mean, I don't know.
It'd be interesting to see like what legal and regulatory frameworks are emerging, because this has been a hot topic in regulation, especially in Europe. This kind of stuff, like, and we talked about how the U.S. Department of Justice filed a lawsuit against Apple. High competition is huge now. There's this new thing called the Digital Markets Act in Europe, which is really trying to crack down on these big tech companies.
My problem with regulation is just that if it's not done wisely with a lot of wisdom. I'll give you an example. You know that thing that pops up every time you go to a website?
Cookie consent.
It's like it's a classic example of this regulation, which was in the interests of the consumer, just making the whole internet very shitty. Like, just,
I agree.
It's such a horrible experience. So, I don't know. This is interesting. Like, I mean, I feel like, there's like this heavy burden on my shoulder. Like, what are we gonna do? But it's way beyond us. I'm kind of glad I'm not in the...
On a personal level, super excited for when these things actually ship that Apple announced. I can't wait. I'm an iPhone user, like I said, despite all of my complaints about why philosophically I'm opposed to it. I can't wait to try this stuff out. It seems really cool. I just wish it were more open and it wasn't subject to like Apple's weird controls and rules and what they'll allow and what they won't allow.
It's so well said. I think I'm gonna, like I said, I think the next thing I'm gonna do right after this is I'm gonna play with the Apple Pencil and this new app if it's out. And I know when I play with it and I have fun and the delightful experience, I'm gonna forget all the philosophical things we discussed. I'm like, screw it. Just do what you want. Like, this is great. I want more of this.
Right. Should we end the episode here?
This has been such an insightful discussion. Again, thank you so much. Like, I feel like I had no clue what was going on in the world of Apple. All I knew was that meme. But like what you unpacked for me, I think I don't need to. Like, I have a good understanding of exactly what happened, and I'm like super excited where it goes. So, and it makes me even more excited about what we're doing here. It's just like we're meeting up every week to just like discuss what we find interesting about AI. And I'll say that again, I feel like I chose a great partner to learn from. Like, this has been great, man. Like a great masterclass on Apple's latest AI announcements during DubDub.
All right, you got to stop calling these things master classes, but this was a fun conversation. Can't wait for next week's episode. I'm still not sure what we'll talk about there. Last call for people who are listening. So we officially launched our podcast last week, and I don't know what will be the relation in time between when we're recording this and when it's launched. We still haven't figured that stuff out, but it's out there now. We launched the entire season 1 back catalog and the intro to season 1. It's season 2, and I think this will go out next. So we're slowly getting some listeners. Anyway, if you're listening to this and you've stuck it out until now, like more than an hour in, you're probably like a fan of our podcast. So please write to us. Give us your feedback, your thoughts, questions you have, anything you want to see us discuss in future episodes. I promise you we will, right now our audience base is probably so small that almost any request we get, we will be able to prioritize it. So if you want to hear us talk about something, just let us know and we'll do it.
Well said. I'll just add one thing to it. And if there's anything that improved your life a little bit even with from what you heard from us, like let us know, just share. That would be great.
Share anything. Let us know what you think. I really
like what you said at the beginning. Like one of can you repeat that? Like your goal or the vision of this is to
is the learning the science of how AI works and the art of using AI to reimagine your life, business, and society. So I think it's kind of a mix of things. One is there are some episodes that we're going to do, which is about how you can use AI in your own life to solve your own problems, build your own things. And then the business and society part of it is that's more applicable if you're a business owner or you have your own business that you're working on, or maybe you just want to understand like what is the impact that other people are using this for on businesses and society. So
well said,
I think
well
that
said.
covers
I think that's
the whole
a perfect
range.
Well said. That's a perfect note to end on. Well,
all right.
Great.
See you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.